So good morning, everybody. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm Director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and welcome to this webinar that we're running with UCAS. And in a moment, we'll hear from Clare Marchant, the CEO of UCAS. We've been running this webinar each year since 2020, and it's proved a very useful event, I think, for people who want to think about university admissions, results, different options for people in this crucial week. Certainly in England, the results have already landed, of course, in some places. So it's been a very big year since we last met, both for HEPI and UCAS, because UCAS have celebrated their 30th anniversary and they published a very interesting book. I don't know if anyone can see that since then. And it's HEPI and HEPI's birthday as well. And we've also published a book about our 20 years. So do look out for those events, those publications. The format for today, as in past years, is first we're going to hear from Clare. Clare is going to say absolutely anything she wants to say, and the headlines really for the most important things for people to think about this year. And then I'm going to take chair's privilege to put some specific questions to Clare about particularly topical issues from the perspective of a policy think tank, which is what HEPI is. And then we'll have a curated question and answer session with the audience, with all the people listening in, which will be chaired by my colleague, HEPI's policy manager, Josh Freeman, who was, until this time last year, a secondary school teacher. So right on the cliff edge, if you like, of the key decisions young people have to make. So do please put your questions in the Q&A. And do please upvote other people's questions if you're particularly keen for those questions to be asked, because then we'll make sure they get in. And we will turn on your own microphone if you're happy to pose your own questions, not your cameras, but your microphones, so you can put your own questions direct to Clare, as in past years. We're going to wind up by 11:45 at the absolute latest, so we're going to keep this short and sweet. We are recording it. Everything is on the record. There are journalists in the virtual room, and there'll be journalists watching the recording back. So just bear that in mind. I hope it won't limit what people want to say, but it's worth remembering. And before, that's really at the end of the housekeeping arrangements for me. So I'm going to turn to Clare now. Clare, can you bring some clarity to us to what's going on? Because the newspapers are rammed full of stories, even more than normal this year, on what's going to happen this week. And there's lots of different angles and stories flying around. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I agree. There's lots of speculation and stories in the press. Some warranted, some perhaps not so much. Certainly, we are returning, I think, to a new normal, and that's probably worth bearing in mind, because it's not a normal like perhaps we saw in 2019, just because A, so much has changed, and B, so much will change for the next 5 to 7 years, which I'll come back to. I think I wanted to talk about just the cycle so far and what we've seen at UCAS, but then pull out 2 or 3 relevant pieces, which we have seen the press cover in the course of the last 3 weeks. And to be fair, we've been talking about for most of the cycle. So firstly, the sort of competition elements. Secondly, the English and UK domicile versus international students. And then also around choice and apprenticeships. And I'll perhaps finish just bringing it back to this week, which is so important, and what's going to potentially happen on Thursday. So I think in terms of the cycle overall, a lot of comparison has been made in terms of demand with last year. And of course, they're quite unusual years, the COVID years. So we at UCAS often compare to 2019, and we know there's nearly 10% increase in terms of those applications coming through on the last sort of really significant milestone, 30th of June, that we measure demand from. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, and I'll come back to, of course, that demand will continue as we go through future years. Secondly, of course, we passed the offer making deadline in in late spring, so during May and June, and actually offer making slightly up across the sector, and indeed within tariff groups, which we talk about a lot, sort of most selective institutions being those high tariff groups. So we know 76% of students have at least one offer. So that's quite good news going into Thursday. I think cost of living is probably a new thing that we've seen in this cycle. It was there a little bit last cycle, but certainly when we have about 1.3 million people who come through our digital front door, and when we survey them, cost of living is very much paramount in their minds. They are very much still determined to progress to higher education, but what that experience might be is definitely being changed and shaped by our current cost of living crisis within the UK. So things like 2/3 of students considering or almost expecting to have a part-time job alongside their studies. And then just in terms of the cycle, of course, last Tuesday we had Scottish results day. And I think it's always worth looking at Scottish results the week before, because it always tells you something. It's a very different landscape in terms of education policy up in Scotland. But we did see a lot of the headlines around the numbers of first choice, and particularly young Scots, 18, 19-year-olds, high numbers, 3/4 getting their first choice. And I'll come back to that in a non-Scottish or UK context in a minute, because I think that probably is likely to happen on Thursday as well. So I think it's been a reasonably smooth cycle so far. I talk to admissions professionals across the UK on a week in, week out basis. They have known grading and what's happening to grading and the return to normal, certainly in England, and different arrangements in devolved nations for as far back as autumn. And I think that has helped them all prepare as they make offers and then obviously make confirmation decisions over the course of this week. But therefore, what's worth focusing on if it is smooth, and it has been fairly normal? I think three things: competition, and I certainly have been fairly clear with students that there will be lots of choice. There is 28,000 courses in clearing, and many thousand of those at the most selective institutions, most selective courses. But of course, with that demographic increase, and we know significant demographic increase over the last couple of years, which will continue to 2030. So varies across the devolved nations, but broadly 3% year on year, it is likely to become more competitive. And so you've got a combination of things, I think, with that return to grading and that increased demographic, which means it's slightly more competitive this year. So certainly our advice to students going into Thursday is always around plan B and preparing for a plan B if you don't quite get the grades. We know increasingly students change their mind because, of course, they applied back in December, January, and that's quite a long time for a 17, 18-year-old, 8 or 9 months. So we have that going on as well. But what we say is, once clearing opens on Thursday, just be aware some of those most selective courses, most competitive courses and institutions might go reasonably quickly. It is always competitive, but even in a competitive year, last year we saw 84% getting their first choice. So again, I think that's going to be a good news story when we come to Thursday. International students have got a lot of press attention. Even over the weekend, I saw a number of different stories. I think it's important to not get it out of proportion at an undergraduate level. Certainly we see around 13% of placed students are international students. We know it's absolutely pivotal to diversity at institutions and on courses. And broadly, that percentage we don't expect to change hugely come Thursday or the end of the cycle in October either. So I think understanding, it in context is really, really important. We know the UK entry rate is just over 37%, 37.5% last year, and we'll be looking for similar entry rates as we go through this year from UK students. And then I think international is always worth, and I try and bring this out when I'm talking to particularly journalists, but UK admissions staff are ever aware of this, that you're competing in a global market. And so actually just keeping an eye on our market share versus Australia and Canada and the US. And whilst we might not change in ranking, just that market share being ebbed away, we need to be welcoming to those undergraduate international students who want to come and study here. I think for me, probably the most exciting thing for this confirmation clearing is the increasing focus on other options other than a traditional undergraduate course. So particularly at UCAS, we are focusing on our offer to help students navigate through apprenticeships at all levels. We know that we did a recent report with the Sutton Trust. It was a great read, but two things out of that. We know that they find it really, really difficult to navigate, but we also know that there aren't enough apprenticeships. And so working with employers, including small, medium businesses, to make sure that there are enough apprenticeships when students go to look at those, and bringing parity to that navigation. So we don't get the situation, which we do in schools and colleges now, where you have a classroom of students who navigate the UCAS undergraduate route and then another classroom who are left looking at multiple websites from multiple employers to find the apprenticeship or the job opportunity that they're looking for. I think it was interesting, just again, a sort of like fairly up to the minute stat that we saw in Scotland. We actually saw the interest in apprenticeships in a Scottish context double on Scottish Results Day. And so again, looking to this week, I'm expecting similar sort of peaks in interest around apprenticeships to take place. But that's all, I suppose, on this cycle and some of the areas that have been focus over the recent weeks and months. One of the things that I'm very cognizant of is what does that mean in a sort of broader trajectory? And we did a series of essays back in April and May on journey to up to 1 million applicants by 2030. And still looking at the trends in terms of demand, we see that very much being a real scenario as we move to 2030. There are obviously things that can impact that, from geopolitics to where the economy goes, which we know massively impacts mature students. But I think there's particular things for us as a sector to sort of worry about there and certainly not take our eye off the ball. One is around all the progress we've made in widening participation and making sure in that more competitive landscape that we keep the focus on those that are most disadvantaged. But I also think just navigating choice, there needs to be more choice, easier to navigate than there is currently, given there could be 900,000 plus students in just 6 years' time. I thought I'd bring it back, Nick, to this week, because very much that's where UCAS and all my colleagues here in Cheltenham are focused on. We are very much looking forward to an advisor webinar on Wednesday. So we've got a piece that we're doing as teachers and advisors come back in to support students. We open the advisor portal early on Thursday morning before everything then lands with students at 8 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. I am expecting, as I said, the numbers who get their first choice, their firm choice as we call it, to be really, really high. The vast majority are going to get their first choice. I think it's important to understand what might happen from 1 o'clock. And we brought that forward because it used to be 3 o'clock, because we knew that there was more chance that students would have teacher and advisor support for longer during the results day period. So what happens 1 o'clock when we're looking at highly selective courses and institutions will be very interesting. But for me, the advice to students is really getting that plan B in place. We do know that, though, and I talk to lots of people, both media, but also at universities and stakeholders. And of course, I think the perception of clearing is pretty outdated. We know now that students 3 or 4 years into tools like Decline My Place and Clearing Plus are absolutely using those tools to change their mind. And sometimes it'll be about the course, and sometimes it'll be about the place that they want to study. And supporting those students and making sure they're doing a bit of prep in advance of Thursday, I think is still super, super important. And knowing who they've got to support out there. And I know, finally, the admissions professionals in each and every institution across the UK are doing an absolutely sterling job as we return to that sort of more competitive landscape and we go forward. Huge amounts of applications they're dealing with and decisions over the coming days. So I suppose my best to you, it's busy at UCAS, but it's as busy in each of the institutions we deal with. So that's probably where I was going to leave it, Nick, and then hand over to you, because I know for my usual sort of results day week grilling, Nick, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Claire. That was a very wide-ranging and useful and constructive way to start, I think. I think we're going to spend about the next 8 or 9 minutes with me putting some questions to you, and then we'll go to Josh, because there are lots of questions coming in already from people listening in, and do upvote questions so that Josh knows which ones to put to Claire. But Claire, can I start with one of the angles in lots of the media, including I read in one newspaper today that it's the worst year ever to be an applicant. You've been very constructive there with lots of wise advice. But do you feel for this cohort, because they had a record GCSE performance in the middle of COVID, they didn't take the exams, but they got record grades. And now they're on the blunt end of the biggest grade deflation, we believe, there's ever been at A-level. And so do you have some sympathy for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I have sympathy for them. You know, I think all of us had a pretty difficult time during COVID. Of course, there's cohorts before this 2023 cohort who also had a very, very difficult time. And I think it's unhelpful to speculate about whether it's the worst impacted cohort or not. I do think that, and we talk to students, but we also survey them, and all of our evidence says that students prefer exams as a method of external assessment. And so that's, you know, as a method of assessment. And so that's what they value. I think they see it as fair and proper. So I think we've got to remember that in the context. But yes, I mean, these are individuals who haven't gone through an external exam before. So of course, there's going to be a level of anxiety when it comes to Thursday. But I think the most helpful thing for all of us involved in the education sector is to help guide those, particularly young people, as they go through that. Remembering the vast majority will, you know, get their email at 8 o'clock on Thursday morning and then be going, great, I'm going in the autumn. It's about targeting, and we talk to this a lot with teaching advisors, targeting that those who aren't in that place or who have changed their minds. But of course, I've got a huge amount of empathy for those students, and I think we should all rally around and give them a bit of support, and also celebrate, because so many of them have achieved even through the COVID pandemic, which affected their teaching and learning. But it's also not in a bubble. You know, each and every one of us, even, you know, young professionals to older professionals like myself, will have had impact from COVID in all sort of manner of ways, you know, education, health, housing, all sorts of things. So yes, empathy, but I think important to see in the wider context.
Great. And there are still lots of opportunities available to this cohort, of course. And you had a very interesting article with Viv Stern in another newspaper this morning explaining that. And in that same newspaper, they talked about how, although there would be a lot of places in clearing this year, maybe not as many as always, but there would be a lot of places. At some universities, those places are actually only available to international students. Is that a much bigger trend this year than normal, of courses and institutions in clearing being open, but only for international students, not home students?
So across the sector, we're not seeing massive changes in terms of those numbers, those broad numbers. Even in terms of that 28,000 that I quoted, that's only a couple of hundred down on this point last year. So again, not material. And going to your point about courses only open to international students, again, it's broadly consistent with previous years. Of course, you know, different courses will have different numbers of places on them, so that's also worth remembering. So I think that the proof in the pudding in terms of competition probably will come on Thursday afternoon, as some of those courses are taken out of clearing as they get filled up. So I think at the moment it's probably speculation, given the numbers are broadly consistent year on year.
Thank you, sir. Act quickly is what I'm hearing. Can I ask you a little bit about apprenticeships? I know you mentioned apprenticeships, but every time I ever speak to schools or careers advisors or parents, they ask me about apprenticeships. And of course, they can work brilliantly well for thousands of people. And ministers talk about them a lot. But isn't the truth that there are very few higher level apprenticeships yet available to young school leavers, and that they're actually incredibly hard still to obtain?
There are not enough. You're absolutely right, Nick. But I think there is something for employers here, and we're working on this, to understand what talent is available to them through apprenticeships. So it's almost, you know, helping students navigate to apprenticeships will show employers the wealth of talent that is available to them in the applicant pool. And I think, you know, we'll provide some tools for employers later this year in that regard. So I think there's a bit of a sort of, you know, if the supply understands what the demand is, then the supply is likely to get better, if that makes sense. And so I think there definitely needs to be more options there. But I think there is almost a bigger issue which precedes that, which is, you know, helping talent navigate through apprenticeships, but also really being able to describe in engaging ways how an apprenticeship and an undergraduate programme are different, because this is about right choices for individuals, and they are very different. You know, turning up to the world of work 3 days a week or whatever it is very different perhaps from a campus, you know, full-time campus undergraduate degree. So I think there's 2 points here. One is about navigation, ease of navigation, understanding what an apprenticeship is, and the other is helping employers see what talent's available so they increase their offer in terms of numbers, because you're right, we want more apprenticeships rather than the number we've got at the moment.
Thank you. And it's clear that Gillian Keegan and Rob Halfon want more apprenticeships as well from everything they say. I wondered if I could come back to the cost of living crisis, because you mentioned it. And of course, UCAS talk a lot more about student cost of living than maybe historically they did. And there's probably 3 things happening, aren't there, at the moment? I mean, the labour market is in a better place than it was during COVID. So it might be easier to get a job rather than going into higher education. Maintenance loans are not going up by anything like inflation if you're looking at England. And you've also got massive changes to the repayment phase of student loans. So this year's entrants will be the first people who have to repay over 40 years, for example, rather than 30 years. And I just wondered if do you think all those factors are relevant to the fact the numbers haven't necessarily gone up quite as much as might have been expected this year, or are some of them more important than others?
Yeah, I mean, when we survey students, certainly the cost of accommodation, the cost of transport, the cost of course materials are very, very much on their mind. You know, those are really particularly cost of accommodation, accessibility of accommodation, you know, where it's located, really important. Actually less so some of the changes to tuition fee arrangements. We as a sector get very exercised about those, but actually, you know, that seems like quite a long way off for most 17, 18-year-olds in terms of both those salary levels and that duration of paying back. So I think it's more about, you know, how am I going to survive month to month? What are going to be my immediate costs, and how am I going to see it through? And what's the availability of things like part-time jobs? Because we know the vast majority, that is absolutely a reality, which, you know, certainly when I went to university, it wasn't the vast majority who took on part-time jobs. It was probably a minority.
Thank you. Yes, and the HEPI Advanced HE data agrees with your own on that. I was struck in your introductory remarks that you've stuck with the journey to a million rhetoric, because there's some people, as you know, who think we're not on course for that. But I wonder if you could just say a tiny bit more about why you think that is still where we are headed.
So certainly it's not rhetoric. It is based on, you know, quite a lot of deep data science, which has a number of scenarios around it. And I'd encourage anybody, you know, you might not want to read the 40 essays, you know, pick out of those which you will. Certainly, Nick, I think you did one, so perhaps read Nick's. But I think if you were going to read anything, it's the introductory half a dozen pages, because that sets out what is a likely scenario, which is the 950, 960,000. But then, you know, a sort of, you know, if everything moved, it could be well over 1 million, but also depending on employment market and geopolitics, it could be slightly less. Either which way, even in the sort of pessimistic scenario or the lesser scenario, you are going to have many, many more than the 700,000 plus today. And so that the issues that are in those essays are still the same. So it is rhetoric, to use your words, but it's based on deep data science, and it's based on looking at things like population data, which is readily available, and application rates and international attractiveness, etc. So there's a number of things play into it, and I absolutely would say it is something that we need to prepare for, because you know, this doesn't happen overnight in 2029, 2030. This is something that progressively increases over each year up to that point. And so, you know, keeping an eye on things like widening participation and choice is today's problem for students who are coming through in 3 or 4 years' time.
Thank you. And of course, you'll be dealing with this in your new role as a Vice Chancellor of the University of Gloucestershire. Congratulations on that. I wondered if you could say a bit about the future. So at UCAS, you've been revamping the application form and personal statements and things like that. We're also likely to have a general election within the next 12 months or so. And sometimes politicians, including the opposition, have flirted with post-qualification admissions, post-qualifications applications. I wondered if you could just say, obviously it'll be a task for your successor as much as for you, but if you could just say a little bit about how you see that application process continuing to change.
So my belief has always been it needs to transform and keep with the times and be relevant, particularly to our younger audience. And increasingly, things we're doing, like we changed the reference for the 2024 entry, we transformed the way clearing works in terms of those digital tools I already referenced, but also things like the personal statement, avoiding that blank sheet of paper syndrome that we know students without as much support find quite daunting. So whatever the questions end up being, really important that we move on with things like that. I wouldn't bet against post qualifications coming back post the next election, regardless of who is in power, because it seems to come back. My predecessor had to deal with it back in 2012-13, and probably my successor will also have to deal with that as it comes forward. We did a huge amount of work, as you know, Nick, on post qualification offer making as a model that potentially could work, but I do, there are some amber flags around that, because of course, just thinking through teaching advisors and the level of support they can give in the summer, absolutely pivotal if you aren't going to take steps back in terms of widening participation. So I am absolutely committed that we keep going with our transformation in the in midst of that. I'd love to see less business rules, less deadlines as we move to more modular learning. I'd love to see ultimately a personal statement that's multimedia. So I think there's a long way to go in terms of transformation outside of post qualifications debates.
Thank you. I'm going to put two more quick questions to you, Claire, and then I'll hand over to my colleague, Josh. And the first one is a really important issue, which is often in the news, but hasn't been at all so far this year, I think, which is the gender split. So how boys in particular in our education system seem to have been falling behind very significantly, including in terms of higher education admissions. Is that something you think will be a story this year as well, or can we see that gap closing, as I think it did a little bit in the last year or two?
Yeah, I think there'll still be a gap, and so it still warrants attention. I always look at the subjects underneath, because I'm always interested in that there is a gap. Where are the real differences? And of course, we've still got, if you take education at the one end, or if you take some, we've seen a 10% increase in computer science courses this year, and you, in those subjects, you just see massive differences in terms of gender. And I would like to see us looking at a sort of more granular level about some of those entry rates, both application rates and entry rates as well, so we can attract more men into nursing and education, and more women into computer science and physics and things like that. So I think there's work to do at a sector-wide macro level, but I think there's also work to do about the image of certain professions and certain subjects open to individuals, because that starts really, really on, before you even choose GCSEs. Some of those stereotypes are set in place, and we need to break those.
Thank you, Claire. And my final question before I hand over to Josh is, you are about to move on from UCAS. So I just wondered what you were proudest of in your time there, and if there's anything that with hindsight you'll do differently.
So I think in terms of proudest, there's many things, but I'll pick one because that's what you asked me to do. I think, when I came in 2017, we served the 700,000 that apply. The fact that we now have 1.5 million individuals who come through our digital front door each and every year, and several 100,000 of those who see us face to face through our events, we've massively increased our reach. And why is that important? Because it means, in that school, in that college, actually we're reaching a wider audience at an earlier point. That's really important, at an earlier point, to inspire them about what the potential is, and the fact that there is no right choice, it's a right choice for you. So I think that massive increase in terms of reach and the earlier reach is the thing I'm proudest of. And you asked me something in hindsight that I would do differently. I certainly wouldn't have joined 4 weeks before 2017 confirmation and clearing, because I think that was a roller coaster ride. You probably need a little bit more prep leading up to it, which I hope I give my successor as they come in. But do you know what? I always think the pandemic was a particularly, I was quite happy not to have had that. And certainly the summer of 2020 was quite difficult. But I take a view that most things in life teach you a lesson that you can go on and then improve. So I'm not one to look back, I'm afraid, Nick.
No, thank you, Claire. And of course, you came to higher education from a different sector, from local government. And it's fantastic that you're now staying in the sector with your new role. So I'm going to hand over to Josh, my colleague, who's going to curate the questions from the audience. Do please keep on upvoting them so that Josh knows which ones to put to Claire.
Great. Thanks very much, Nick. And thank you very much, Claire, for your diligent comments. We're now going to take questions from the audience, so I'll come to you, I'll unmute you, which you won't be able to do yourself, and then we'll ask you to read out your question to Claire. Please do keep them brief, as we want to get through as broad a range of questions as possible. And there are a couple of anonymous questions as well, which I will be reading out. And do please keep adding questions to the chat, and also upvote the questions that you most want to see posed. So can we please start with Helen Carasso? Your question, please. So we're going to come to you, we'll unmute you, and then we'll ask you to read that out.
Thank you, Josh, and many thanks, Claire and Nick. We've talked a little bit about international students. My question was, are you seeing any differences between the 4 national regions, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland universities, in terms of the proportion of international offers that are being made and or the grades and conditions of those offers to international students?
Great question, Helen. Josh, do you want me to just leap in? I'm assuming that yes, thank you. And thank you for the comment about diligence. I don't think I've ever been called diligent before, but that was a nicer, really good question, Helen. I think not broadly across the 4 nations. I think, you know, your point about, you know, grades, I would have to revert back on, because I don't think we've looked into that. But in terms of broad, you know, offer making, and well, obviously we don't know about confirmation decisions yet. We'll know that more of that on Thursday. But I'm thinking back to Scotland last week, and we didn't see. I mean, it's a very different landscape in Scotland, so it's very hard to compare to the rest of the UK. But we didn't see anything particular in Scotland. I mean, I'm a great believer that, you know, having been on many campuses, that our international diversity, the diversity it brings, is something to be celebrated at, you know, undergraduate level. You know, I've got a son of my own who'll be going either to a degree apprenticeship or hopefully to university, one of the two, in a couple of years' time, and I think it just opens the world, you know, in terms of who you're interacting with. But back to your question, there's nothing particular across the 4 nations, but we can look into that grading one and perhaps include that in some of the material we release over the course of the week.
Thank you. The overwhelmingly most upvoted question is about the gap between predicted and actual grades, which is from an anonymous attendee, so I'll read it out, which is, are you concerned about the potentially large gap between predicted grades and actual grades? It seems larger this year, according to estimates. What are the implications of that? And then I would add on top of that the comment, which is, are we expecting there more students to miss their offers, and what would be the consequences of that, if so?
I think I'll come back to predicted grades in the round, but if I just answer the question in the context of this year, firstly, I'm not particularly concerned this year, because I think because universities and colleges, and there's many universities and colleges I know listening to this, have known around the return to normal, certainly in England, and then the different arrangements of the devolved nations as far back as September last year. I don't think I'm concerned about that. I think the offer making was made in that context. I think there's a broader issue about predicted grades, and we're looking into how we can help schools and colleges just in terms of understanding how accurate they are with predicted grades, because you know, just looking at those year on year and how accurate they can be is something that I think we at UCAS, but the sector at large, need to keep an eye on. You know, it's very easy to, I think, to over predict, you know, but we need to be giving data to schools and colleges to get as accurate as possible around that.
Thank you. Can we go to Paul Woodgates, please?
Hi, thanks very much, Claire. That's really interesting. You've touched on international students a couple of times, but I wanted to ask whether you think there is evidence that the supply of places to home undergraduates is in some way being constrained by the number of places being offered to international undergraduates in total. If bearing in mind, of course, that much of the growth in international is actually postgraduate, but do you think that is causing fewer places to be offered to UK undergraduates?
Great question, Paul. And you know, at a macro, a sort of sector level, it's absolutely not. You know, we are not in a capped numbers territory in England, and so you know, I'm expecting to see, you know, really significant numbers of UK placed students on Thursday. What I can't speak to, Paul, is, you know, an individual course at an individual institution, you know, and I expect, you know, someone could find that where, you know, there's a sort of you know, not a cap, but, you know, there's some constraint around that course, which means choices are being made. But we are not seeing it at either sector wide. We're not seeing it when we look at sort of subsector. But that doesn't mean that, you know, on individual course, I could absolutely rule that out hand on heart. But I think, you know, we're in a environment where universities, you know, can recruit up to the number that is feasible. So I think that's something to be celebrated, which obviously we weren't in that position 10, 12 years ago.
Thank you. Let's go to Johnny Rich, please.
Hi, hi Claire. Good to see you. Over the weekend, the Sunday Times was reporting a shock story about high dropout rates. From the evidence they presented, I couldn't actually see that these were historically any higher than previously. But that aside, I wanted to ask about clearing and dropout, and whether clearing supports good choices or whether it might contribute to higher dropouts, and whether or not the clearing system could be adapted in future to ensure that it leads to good matches.
Thanks, Johnny. Great question. I mean, I also was struggling to understand where that data had come from over the weekend. So you and me both. But to your question about clearing, I mean, I think it's transformed over the last 3 or 4 years. So things like Clearing Plus and Decline My Place do put the sort of digital tools in the hand of the individual. Is there more we can do to make sure that that's a really well-informed decision? Certainly, you know, getting students to use some of the tools. So we've got university pages on the website. They can go in and do virtual tours on individual university websites, you know, subject guides, those sorts of things, going to face-to-face some of the clearing days that are open this weekend. All of that will help. We can always do more in terms of the data that drives some of the matching and the recommendations that you're talking about, because we do know the better informed a choice, the more likely they are to continue successfully and end, you know, their studies and get great outcome. So I think there's always more we can do, Johnny. We have taken massive strides over the last 3 or 4 years, but I would like to see us continue that over the next 3 or 4, particularly in that matching and recommendation space, which is so pivotal.
Thank you, and maybe some useful guidance for your successor, whoever that may be. Can we jump now to, I think we'll take 2 questions in one, just so we capture as broad a range as possible. So we'll go to Dennis Sherwood first, and then I'll read out the top question by an anonymous attendee. So let's jump to Dennis now, please.
Hi, thank you. My question is this. Ofqual's chief regulator is on record as acknowledging that grades are reliable to one grade either way, a statement that seems to be confirmed as valid in this morning's very interesting HEPI blog. Suppose, say, then, that a med school student holding an offer of AAA in chemistry, physics and biology phones the admissions office on Thursday and asks, I've just been awarded AAB. According to Ofqual, grades are reliable to one grade either way. May I have my place, please? What's your advice to the admissions officer and also to the student, please? Thank you.
Hi, Dennis.
Right.
Do you want to ask the next question, Josh, first?
I will just so I can get through a couple more. Thank you. So I'll add this one about deferrals. So there's allegedly up to 70,000 sort of deferrals, which would be a big uplift from 23,000 the previous year. Can you confirm this number, or is there any truth to that?
Yeah, okay. So we'll go firstly with a sort of grade difference. Dennis, I think you asked the same question last year. I'm pretty sure you've asked me each of the last 4 years around grade inaccuracy. Ultimately, UCAS's business is to make sure that application process is smooth as possible, but provide the information and guidance that informs the choices. And Ofqual is as you said, the exams regulator. And you will know that very, very often in those near miss cases that you're talking about, in that scenario you're talking about, it is a range of data points that a university takes into account. And so it won't just be, and I can't remember, I think you said AAB, but it won't just be those grades. It will be then looking at some of the, whether it's the reference or the personal statement, or of course we've introduced those new widening participation questions, 7 of them this year, which will help inform contextual offers. So I think it's a range of data that takes place. So I would need to look at the individual circumstances before I sit my high horse and start advising admissions professionals or the academics that they're working with. So I think, first of all, it's not my place to comment on exams and exam regulation, but it is for the university in the individual circumstance. If a grade is, 1 grade difference, for them to make a call on that, and that will depend on course by course, as you probably know, Dennis. The second question was around deferrals, Josh. And I recognise 73,000. I don't recognise the 23,000. And there is a marginal increase, but I think it's also in terms of deferral applications rather than applicants. So we need to be just very careful about what data points we're using here. They are such a small percentage. I would just encourage people to put this in context when you're looking at deferral applicants or deferral applications. They are, if you think about applications, that's over 3 million applications we actually get in any given year. So it's a small percentage of the overall cohort. I think, the other thing we've seen an increase in is reappliers. So you have to then look at deferrals with reappliers to understand the true picture. I think students, when we survey them, are pretty canny, though, to the fact that the cost of living crisis is not going anywhere soon, and it's likely to be there in next year at least. And they're also pretty canny to the fact that there'll be more 18-year-olds. We've been pushing those messages out through Journey to a Million, but obviously through wider channels for quite a period now. So the fact it's going to get more competitive year on year, I think, will have an influence. So we'll see where it lands on Thursday, but I think you need to look at deferrals with reappliers and then look at applicants rather than applications, and it will give us a more realistic sort of percentage, which will still be pretty low.
Thank you. And I think with the last 2 questions, we'll jump to Michael Larkin, and then we'll go back to Helen Carrasso for the last one.
Hello, Claire. Hello, Claire. Thank you so much for giving the time here. I now live in Edinburgh, and I've looked at the Scottish system. Do you think it would be helpful to you that the rest of the UK should move assessments to 17 a year earlier, as in Highers, so places at university could be secured earlier, as happens in Scotland?
Sorry, Claire, just to make sure we get through as many questions as possible, can we jump to Helen, I think, for the last question?
Thanks again. I was a bit of a forward-looking question, which is with the debate about the LLE model of funding. Obviously, this is encouraging people or institutions to provide degrees more in modular format, where you might study for 1 year, have a break, go back again. Is UCAS starting to think about how it would operate in that model? I know there's obviously a possibility of doing some of that now, but it's a much smaller part of the sector. So how would UCAS work with that model?
Yeah, great question, Helen. You've got 2 questions in there. Well done. I'll go back to the first question from Mike, if I may. I think there's pros and cons, Mike, in terms of moving to a sort of Scottish. You're just talking about a part of the Scottish system. Of course, there's many things that are different in the Scottish system, not just the age and the timing sort of piece that you pointed out. So I think it needs to look at the whole. Certainly, when we looked at, and it's slightly different rather than your question, but when we looked at post-qualification, the more you look at the system as a whole, the more everything you move one thing and other things are impacted. So I would be slightly nervous about any sort of moving one thing to the Scottish system when actually the Scottish system is almost entirely different in so many different ways. So I would be cautious about that. Helen, your second question just remind me, it was at LLE, wasn't it? It was a great question. We are absolutely in that space, Helen, doing quite a lot of work with the student loans company behind the scenes in terms of mechanics. However, and the sort of short courses pilots sort of indicate this, I believe the biggest key to unlock in whole lifelong learning and whatever it's called in future is information, advice and guidance. It's getting into whether it's mature students or those that have never considered coming into education post 18. How do you get to those hard to reach groups? How do you really unlock it? Otherwise, we'll end up circulating modular courses, micro credentials around the same, 50% that currently get into higher education over the course of their sort of the period up to their 30. So I think the key is information, advice and guidance, both mature students and to that 17, 18-year-old cohort. And that at the moment, I think, unless you lock that, unless you work with the likes of combined authorities and the third sector and UCAS, of course, but to unlock that and to really get people thinking about what they want to do with the 4-year entitlement, actually the mechanics in the background can work brilliantly. The courses can be on offer, but you need the demand at the end of the day. So yes, a load of work going on about that. Helen, thanks for a great question at the end.
Great, and thanks very much. We will jump right back to Nick, I think, just to finish off.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks, Claire. All I'm going to do, because we're going to stick to time, is to say thank you to you, Claire. It's been another very illuminating session that I think people will have found very helpful for preparing for Thursday. And also thank you for all you've done over the last, whatever it is, 6 or 7 years, for millions of applicants and people finding their way on the next stage of their lives. And we've always enjoyed very much engaging with you and found you and your colleagues to be very open. So thank you for that. And thank you to you for this morning and to your colleagues, Ben and others behind the scenes who've helped. Thank you to my colleagues, Emma behind the scenes, who's put it together, Lucy, Josh, who you've all just seen. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the summer. And if you're waiting for your results or your children's results, or your pupils' results, good luck for Thursday. Many thanks.